All right, philosophers, let's dive into a real puzzler. Idiolects. The idea that each of us speaks a unique language. It sounds kind of paradoxical, right? I mean, we use language to communicate, so how can it be unique to each person? That's what we're going to try to figure out today.
Yeah, it's a question that has kept philosophers busy for a long time, and there are some really interesting theories out there.
Definitely. And we've got a whole stack of sources to help us unpack them. We're going to look at two main viewpoints. First, the conventionalist view from David Lewis. He sees language as this kind of social contract, like a set of rules we all agree on.
Right.
And then we'll jump into the world of Noam Chomsky and his internalist perspective, which focuses on this internal grammar, the I language that each of us has. Ready to get philosophical?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Let's start with Lewis. He was trying to figure out how to connect the abstract side of language, mapping sentences to meanings, with how we actually use it socially.
Yeah, he was wrestling with this question. How can something as abstract as mapping sentences to meanings actually work in the real world for us to communicate with each other?
It's like trying to understand how something invisible can move physical objects.
Uh,
So how did he propose we solve this?
well, he said that language is basically a convention, a solution to a coordination problem. Kind of like driving. We all agree to drive on the right side of the road,
Right.
even though we could just as easily have chosen the left.
Okay, I see where this is going. Instead of crashing into each other head on, we make a rule, a convention, and everybody wins. But how did that work for something as complex as language?
Well, Lewis had this brilliant idea. He outlined 6 conditions for a convention to exist, emphasizing the idea that conventions stick around because it's in our best interest to follow them.
So let me see if I can sum this up for our listener who's also into philosophy. We agree on certain language rules, word meanings, grammar, because it makes communication smoother. It's better for everyone if we're all truthful and trust each other to be truthful too. It's like a linguistic handshake.
That's a great way to put it, like a silent agreement to use language in a consistent way. Of course, Lewis knew that this is kind of an idealized view. Real-world language is messy, full of exceptions.
Oh, yeah.
Think about indexicals, words whose meaning depends on the context, like I or here,
Right.
or ambiguity, where one word can have multiple meanings.
Absolutely. Like if I say I'm going to the bank, do I mean the financial institution or the edge of a river? So how does Lewis's theory deal with these tricky situations?
Well, one important thing to remember is that Lewis is focused on expression meaning. That's the meaning that's attached to a word or sentence, like the dictionary definition, no matter what the speaker actually means to say.
Uh-huh.
But there's another layer of meaning, speaker meaning. That's what the speaker actually intends to communicate, which can be way more subtle and depend heavily on the situation.
So expression meaning is like the rule book, and speaker meaning is how we actually use language, bending the rules to get our point across. That makes sense. But if Lewis is all about these formal rules, how do we understand each other even when we don't follow them perfectly? Like when someone uses slang or makes a grammar mistake, we still usually understand.
That's a great question. And it leads us to a really interesting challenge to Lewis's conventionalist view. And that's where Donald Davidson comes in. He really shook things up. He argued that the initial way we interpret what someone says, what he called first meaning, isn't just based on conventions. He said we often understand each other even when words are used the wrong way or grammar is messed up.
Like I think about all those text messages I get with typos and autocorrect errors. We seem to be pretty good at figuring out the meaning, even when it's a mess. So how do we do that, if not for shared conventions?
Davidson used this really interesting pair of ideas, prior theories and passing theories. Prior theories are like our assumptions about what someone means. They're based on what we've experienced before and how much we know about the language. It's kind of where we start from.
Okay.
But sometimes those assumptions are wrong. And that's where passing theories come in. Passing theories are how we interpret what's being said right at that moment, on the fly, so we can make sense of it.
So it's like our brains are constantly working, figuring things out, adjusting how we understand based on what we see and hear. It's not just about following the rules, but actively creating meaning.
Exactly. Davidson even used the analogy of understanding someone speaking a foreign language. We don't have a set of rules to go by, so we have to piece together their meaning from the context, gestures, whatever we can grasp.
That's a great point. It seems like Davidson's saying that successful communication takes a lot more than just shared rules. It takes flexibility, intelligence, maybe even a bit of mind reading to really understand what the speaker's trying to say.
Exactly. And this is really relevant for our philosophical listener because it challenges some traditional ideas about meaning. It suggests that meaning isn't just out there in the world waiting for words to capture it. It's actually created through this process of interpretation, this back and forth.
So we've got Lewis focusing on those shared conventions and Davidson pushing back, saying that individual interpretation and context are really important too. Two very different ways of looking at how we communicate at all. But where does this leave us with this idea of the idiolect, that each person has their own unique language? It seems like we still need some common ground.
That's a great point. And it brings us to Noam Chomsky, who really changed how we think about this. He shifted the focus from external shared language to the internal I language inside each of us. This is where things get really interesting.
I love it when things get interesting. Chomsky's always good for making you think. So how does he approach this idea of individual language? Okay, so we've got Lewis with his social contract view and Davidson with his emphasis on how we interpret things individually. Now it's Chomsky's turn. Tell me about this mind-blowing stuff.
Chomsky. He comes at it from a totally different angle. He says, forget about the external social parts of language. Let's look inside to the internal grammar, the I language that we each have. He thinks there's actually a dedicated part of our brains, the language faculty, that's responsible for our language skills.
So instead of thinking about language as this thing out there that we all share and learn, he's saying it's in here, like built into our brains. It's like we're all walking around with our own little language operating systems.
That's a great way to think about it. And one of his most famous arguments is this thing called the poverty of the stimulus. He basically points out that kids don't hear enough language to really learn it just from experience alone. I mean, they only hear a certain number of sentences, and a lot of times those sentences aren't even grammatically correct. But they still manage to figure out these really complex grammar rules that let them create an endless number of new sentences.
So it's not just about kids being like little statisticians figuring out the patterns,
That's
right?
right, exactly.
There's got to be something else going on, something innate that helps them make sense of language.
Exactly. Chomsky says it's this thing called universal grammar. It's like this set of basic principles that are underneath all human languages. Think of it like a blueprint for language hardwired into our brains. And that's what lets us learn language so much faster and easier than if we were starting from scratch.
Okay, so if we've all got this universal grammar thing in our brains, wouldn't we all end up speaking the same language? Because that doesn't seem to be how it works.
Right. And that's what makes it even more interesting. Chomsky thinks that each person's I language develops by setting these like parameters, like switches in the brain that get turned on or off depending on what language you hear when you're little.
So the basic blueprint's the same, but those little settings are what makes languages so different from each other.
Exactly. It's like we're all getting a customized version of the language software.
I like that. But how does all this fit in with the idea of communication? If we're all running these unique language programs, how can we understand each other at all?
That's the big question. And to be honest, Chomsky doesn't really give us the complete answer. He knows that communication happens, of course, but he thinks it might be more about finding overlaps between our own individual I languages rather than relying on a perfectly shared set of rules.
So it's more like we're constantly translating between our own internal languages, trying to find this common ground where meaning can happen. It's a lot more complicated than just plugging into the same language network, that's for sure.
Definitely. And for someone who's really into philosophy, Chomsky's ideas bring up some huge questions about the relationship between language, thought, and reality. I mean, if language is really an internal thing, a reflection of how our minds are structured, then how does it connect to the outside world at all?
Yeah.
How do our internal representations match up with the actual objects and events that we experience?
It's like asking how the software of our minds interacts with the hardware of the world.
Yeah.
And if our languages are truly unique, does that mean our thoughts and perceptions are unique too?
Very.
Do we each experience reality in a totally different way? Wow. That's a lot to think about.
It really is. These are questions that philosophers are still trying to figure out. I mean, we've just scratched the surface of this topic, but hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listener, some new ways to think about this amazing world of idiolects.
It definitely has for me. So for all you philosophy fans out there, here's a final thought to chew on. If our languages really are unique, what does that mean for the way we understand ourselves and the world around us? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Idiolects. See you next time.